Hello, my name's Lisa Ashes. I am an independent consultant for curriculum, English, and teaching and learning. My background is in curriculum development, and my first book that I wrote was in Manglish about how we can harness maths and English across the curriculum to develop high-level literacy and numeracy. My second book is Teacher in the Cupboard and how we use the curriculum to solve problems. So I'm pleased to be your host for this webinar series on curriculum development, and I really hope you find this useful. Hello and welcome to video 2 of 3. In the previous video, we considered our vision, what it is that we are hoping to achieve as a department, what our students will know, think like, act like as a result of their time with us. Today, we are considering the knowledge that we are providing our students. So what knowledge do we want to provide? How do we label that knowledge? Why is that knowledge important? This video, as with the others, is to evoke conversation within your department. Today, we're talking about knowledge. But let's start by thinking about the reflection of our learning barriers that students face. So the things that stop our students from making excellent progress, the barriers to their learning. This activity is designed to make you think about the reality of the issues our students face. I want you to discuss as a department what stops your students from making excellent progress. What are the barriers that your students face? Now think about learning behaviours. Perhaps you've got students who are not reflective, so they don't look back on past mistakes, so therefore they keep making the same mistakes. That's a barrier to learning because they are not making progress. Perhaps you have students who are not persistent, so they don't persevere in challenges that they're faced with. They give up too easy. Whatever it is that you see as a barrier, I want you to write it around gingerbread man number 1. You can use just a blank piece of paper to create this. Draw 2 gingerbread men. One of the gingerbread men is the barriers to learning, and the other one is going to be the dream. Let's start with the barriers. Now that we've got the barriers, we need to turn our attention to the dream. What is it that we want from our students? So for example, if you have down that students are unable to stick at tasks, this is a barrier to learning. But on the other side, on gingerbread man number 2, what we're going to write down is the dream. So if students are unable to stick at tasks, what we want are students who are confident to keep going when they experience these failures and these difficulties, so they learn from each of their mistakes. So for every negative you have on your first gingerbread man, I want you to consider what a perfect world would look like. Pause the recording and do this second half now. Now that you've got your barriers to learning identified and you have identified what you would like to have as a dream, we need to consider how we will get our students from one side to the other. Now, what comes in between these 2 gingerbread men is your actions, the things that you teach students every day, the way that you practice in the classroom. To remove the barriers, we must do something. For example, your daily lessons can remove barriers to learning through a systematic teaching of specific learning habits. The ability to learn can be learned. This comes from Guy Claxton on Building Learning Power. And often we look at our students as what they are and not considering what they could potentially be. Every lesson with our students is an opportunity to teach them how to learn. So you might consider what your biggest barriers to learning are. When you look at your list of learning barriers, identify the ones that, if they were removed, they would make the biggest difference to your students' learning and their ability to make progress. When you've identified the barriers that you want to develop, you can then consider the signature pedagogies that support removing those barriers. So for example, if we have a student who is unable to stick at tasks, then we need to consider how we might develop in that student a growth mindset. There are many activities that we can do for students and with students in the classroom, but what we need to be able to do is to teach them that learning comes with effort, and they need to feel the success of the efforts that they are putting in. I want you to focus in on the biggest barrier to learning in your subject. I want you to consider which of the habits of learning that, if it was being consistently taught, it might remove that as a barrier. So whether it is being imaginative, disciplined, collaborative, inquisitive, or persistent, your daily teaching, the activities that you do with your students in the classroom, the knowledge that you give your students about this habit of learning can support in removing that specific barrier. So consider which one of these you as a department could focus in on in order to remove that as a barrier for learning. I want you to consider how that learning behaviour would develop over time. So remember, at the beginning, when a student is unable to do that activity, what does that look like in the classroom? Can you identify what a student might look, act, sound, learn like at the beginning of their journey? Can you recognise what that might look like once they're developing? Can you recognise what that would look like if they are confident? And how about what that would look like if they were an expert in that? By breaking the habits of learning down from beginning all the way up to expert, what we can do is consider how we might give students the knowledge in lessons when we recognise that they are at a different level with this specific learning habit. So as a department, choose the habit that you think would make the biggest difference to your students' learning and see if you can break that down into beginning, developing, confident, and expert. And consider what you would need to do in the classroom in order to get them from one side to the other. Today's session is all about knowledge, but it's also about removing learning barriers through teaching the right knowledge. Today's session should help you to place your department's curriculum in the essential ingredients to developing the right knowledge for your department. I want you to have a go at that activity again, but now you are going to consider the things that your Year 11s typically still do not know at the beginning of Year 11. I am considering those things that you feel like they should know it by now. I want you to complete the gingerbread men activity again. Now what we'll consider is that space in the middle, how we can use our curriculum to support developing their knowledge from their first moments with us until they leave. So give this activity a go again. Write down everything that your Year 11s typically don't know and you wish they did. What's the dream? What do you want them to know? And then we'll consider what we can do about this. Now, if there are a lot of things that your Year 11s don't know, then your curriculum might still be developing. We need to consider what we teach them earlier and the knowledge that we give them so that when they get to Year 11, they have all of the knowledge and all of the skills that they need to complete our curriculum. The following activities will help you to accurately rate your position when it comes to knowledge in the curriculum. It'll also help you to consider how improvements might be made to the knowledge that you provide your students, and hopefully evoke some really purposeful conversations on how you can improve no matter where your starting point. A great book and a great bit of research comes from Graham Nuttall in The Hidden Lives of Learners. Now, Graham Nuttall investigated how students learn by observing learning in a school over the course of 2 years. And this will come as no surprise, but he observed that students had to come into contact with a complete idea or practice a skill at least 3 times consecutively, so in a close space of time, before they had that as something that they could still remember a year later. When knowledge is given too quickly, students may remember it in the short term, but they will not remember it over time. So new concepts are not created and transferred into long-term memory until enough information has been accumulated. If it doesn't happen, then that information is lost and forgotten. And we don't want to spend our time teaching students things that they will just forget. So we need to consider how we are allowing students to get the knowledge, but then to practice with the knowledge as well. We all know that we don't feel like we have enough time as teachers to teach the curriculum we have. We need to be really clever and careful with the time that we do have. We don't want to teach and reteach GCSE from the moment they come in at year 7, because that is not a rich curriculum. What we want is to provide the right knowledge and direction for our students so that they remember the knowledge that we do give them. This is another excellent book, one of my favourites for teaching and learning, Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel T. William. What is happening when we read from a cognitive point of view? Now I'm going to show you something. I want you to pause the recording and give it a go to read it in silence. It's about what it feels like when you read this. And this comes from Why Don't Students Like School? So have a look at this and think about how it feels to read it. Pause the recording and give it a go. If you've had a go at that, I do hope that it felt the same to you as it did to me when I first read that. It was difficult, it was vague, and it was meandering. I kept having to go back to the start and read this over again, and it still didn't seem to stick together for some reason. All of the words I understand. I know what a procedure is, I know simple, I know arrange. There's not a word in there that I don't understand, but for some reason I could not make sense of this. Now, if I give this a title, pause and try and read it again. You might notice now that it makes sense, and that's because it has context. So it's the context that helps us to make sense of the words that are in front of us. That is really important when we think about whether our students are knowledge rich or whether they're knowledge poor. Not during the phonics phase, they can learn to decode, but it's during the understanding phase where they have to talk about their understanding of what's within the text. They can decode the words, but if they have no context to stick the knowledge to that is in that text, then it's difficult, it's vague, and it is meandering. Now, we can experience that as adults without context, but what we want is to make sure that our students have enough knowledge so that the reading text that we do give them don't feel this way for them. When we're providing them with new information, they have the context in order to stick that to. So we need to consider how we ensure our students are knowledge rich. Now, if we just start teaching GCSE content from year 7, then we are missing an opportunity to develop that knowledge base. So we need to consider the knowledge that we are giving them. Now, before we think about the exact knowledge that we are giving our students, let's think about the types of knowledge that we might provide them with. So first of all, substantive. Substantive knowledge are facts, principles, or concepts that are deemed fact. So they are the things that are static, they don't move, they are true. And we need to consider how these facts might build towards their students' end result. We need to consider how we carefully build the facts that our students know so that they are able to stick new facts to old. We need to consider how we are developing our students towards having all of the knowledge that they need at the end of their time with us. Now, this activity, I have used a literature example here, but I want you to choose an exam question from your syllabus. This could be GCSE or A level. I've chosen GCSE here. And what I want you to choose is a typical higher mark question. I want you to look at that higher mark question and consider the substantive knowledge, so the facts that students need to successfully answer that question. Now be careful, because there might be a lot more factual knowledge that they need than just simply appears in the question. Consider the journey that students need to go on in knowledge to be able to answer this longer or the higher mark question successfully. So what are the facts that they need to know? What are the principles that are deemed fact that they need to know from your subject to be able to answer your longer or higher mark questions? Using the same exam question that you investigated for the previous activity, I want you to look even further at facts, principles, and concepts that are deemed fact, the substantive knowledge. The next activity asks you to consider how you might build that knowledge, how you might map the substantive knowledge required for this endpoint so that it builds from year 7 all the way up to year 11. Now be careful, because you don't want to teach them the same thing year on year, but consider the facts that you do teach them in year 7, how that might link to the facts that you teach them in year 8, how that might link to year 9, and so on, so that when they're at their end point, they have all the knowledge that they need to answer that specific question, to allow the students to recall the knowledge that will lead them towards success. Pause the recording and give this activity a go. Consider this question. Do scientists use the same method to critique a source as historians? And the answer behind that question leads us to understand what disciplinary knowledge really is. It is how knowledge is established, how secure knowledge is in our subjects, how it continues to be revised, how we look at things in English, mathematics, modern foreign languages, science, in any subject, how we read in our subject, how we write in our subject, how we think in our subject. So each subject, the disciplinary knowledge will be different. There are overlaps between them, but we need to consider how students approach our subject and why they approach it in that way. How secure is that knowledge? Is there a way to look at things differently that perhaps we are not teaching, or perhaps will evolve over time? How the thinking in our subject is continually revised. So disciplinary is different in every subject. I want you to consider your subject and how the disciplinary way of working in your subject has evolved over time. Who are the people who created these ways of behaving? How might your subject evolve over time? If you're a historian, historians are expected to make their assumptions, concepts, and methods explicit so that they can be critically assessed by academic community of practice and to present arguments for interpretive decisions that they make. So if we're teaching mini historians, I know they won't all be, but we are teaching them to think in this way, to read in this way, to gather evidence in this way. And so this is disciplinary for our subject. But if we are mathematics teachers, mathematics is a way to settle in the mind a habit of reasoning. Mathematics is an exact and definite science. Every student of mathematics has to reason properly without any prejudice. So how a historian thinks is different to how a mathematician thinks, is different to how a scientist might think with their methods and their knowledge of apparatus and their data analysis and use of evidence. Is different to how an artist might think or read or research, because they're thinking about interpretation of the elements and how they can be used and combined in order to create specific and desired effects. So consider your subject. This is a conversation and perhaps a bit of research to be done as a department. How has this disciplinary way of thinking evolved over time? Who are the people who created this way of thinking? And how might your subject evolve in the future? Pause the recording and consider your subject carefully for the disciplinary knowledge. There are some other questions we might ask to explore the disciplinary knowledge. How do you read in your subject? How do you write in your subject? How do you question? How do you review findings in your subject? How do you complete practical activities or collaborate? And why is it done in this way? The more that you consider this, the more that you will uncover the disciplinary ways of working within your subject. Now, you might know these already, but what we need to do is to make these explicit to our students and to evolve their thinking over time. We can't expect a student coming in year 7 to think like a scientist, to think like a historian, to think like a mathematician. We need to consider how we develop the journey of that student. Moving back to your exam question, let's now consider the disciplinary knowledge required to answer this question. Return to your chosen exam question and ask, what disciplinary knowledge does a student need to have in order to answer this question? Before we move on to the next knowledge type, we can consider a child's journey, again, thinking this time about disciplinary knowledge. Consider the knowledge required for the exam question. How might you evolve a child's disciplinary knowledge so that they're absolutely ready by the time they reach examination age to tackle those longer questions, thinking in a disciplinary way for your specific subject? Now we are considering procedural knowledge, the skills and techniques that our students use every day in our subject. Now, often there's a confusion between procedural and disciplinary, but many of the things that we teach them as disciplinary become procedural because we teach them in such a way that it becomes habit. It's a skill, it's a technique that they use over and over. However, it's not deemed as fact and it can evolve and develop over time. But procedural is something that you do without even thinking about it. Now, consider this question. What are the most frustrating mistakes while marking work you come across time and time again in students' work? Quickly pause and have that discussion. Now, for me, one of the most frustrating mistakes are capital letters and full stops. And this is procedural knowledge. Now, the students who have avoided using capital letters and full stops for the longest of times have actually learned the wrong procedural knowledge. And so it's their procedure to not use the capital letters and full stops. Placing a capital letter at the start of a sentence is procedural knowledge. It should happen without thinking. Not putting a capital letter at the beginning of a sentence is also procedural. It's a procedural mistake. It's a learned behavior. And so that's why we often end up circling capital letters and full stops as a mistake regularly. What we need to consider is how we will allow them to practice so that it becomes procedural again. By just writing a capital letter and full stop on the work, students are seeing that they've done it wrong, but actually their procedure is to do it wrong. We need to change their procedures. So consider the common mistakes that you see in your students' work that may be procedural mistakes, mistakes that have been learned as a habit over time, and consider how you will remove that as a barrier to success by reteaching and giving time towards developing this as a new procedure for students. In our longer exam questions, we will need procedural knowledge from our students. Again, looking at your longer exam question that we've been focusing on for each of the knowledge types, now consider what's the procedural knowledge required for success in this question? What do they need to do without thinking? Also consider what's the difference between procedural knowledge here and the disciplinary knowledge. Pause the recording and consider this now. It's important to consider how we might develop students from the beginning of their time with us to the end of their time with us. So again, we can consider how the knowledge required to answer those final exam questions can be built over time so that it becomes ingrained. So there will be skills required that our students cannot do when they come in at year 7 that we can practice with over time, but recognizing that it is procedural, and the aim is that they can do it without thinking. In order to do this, we'll need to consider their journey over time. Finally, we're considering the hinterland, the extra knowledge, the knowledge that it's a nice to have, it's not an absolutely necessary in order to answer those final exam questions. But remember, the more knowledge rich our students are, the more successful they will be, because they are able to add new knowledge to the knowledge that already exists within them. So we need to consider what extra information we can give our students. The hinterland is nice to know. It adds knowledge at the edges, bringing life to our curriculum. It increases depth and little niche details about a particular area of study. It can increase the breadth, wider surveys across the domain of any curriculum area that help to locate any specific core element within a wider frame. So the hinterland knowledge can be planned over time too. Hinterland does not necessarily mean that it is extra knowledge around the topic that you're covering. It could also be the big picture of learning alongside what they're learning, so they can actually see where their knowledge sits within the big picture. So for example, for English, we might use a timeline to add hinterland knowledge. They don't necessarily need to know where exactly a particular text is sitting in the timeline for literature. However, later, when they come to study at A-level or degree, this hinterland knowledge comes in very, very useful. It also allows them to make connections between different texts. So consider what hinterland knowledge would be really useful for your students and why, but always avoid clutter. Remember, information overload does not lead to good learning outcomes. So we need, if we're adding hinterland knowledge, to know why we're adding that hinterland knowledge. What's the purpose of it for the student? How will it help them to be a better learner by having that particular knowledge? This session, looking at knowledge, is to allow you time to discuss, consider the knowledge that is already on your curriculum, whether you know why it's there, whether it's the right knowledge to be there, whether that knowledge could be adapted or considered more carefully over a period of time. So really consider how confident you are as a department in the knowledge that you teach being the best knowledge for student progress. Based on the previous activity, where would you honestly place your curriculum in terms of the knowledge provision? Wherever you've placed yourself on the knowledge provision within your curriculum, there's always something that can be done to make it even better. So you might want to consider your end point and how you can systematically build knowledge so that it sticks. You might think about which questions your students struggle with and how you might improve teacher knowledge over time to improve their ability to tackle those questions. You might think about tweaks that you want to make to perfect what students know at the end of their time with you. Now, if you feel like the knowledge that's in your curriculum is excellent, you might still add challenge. If you think that the knowledge that is being provided in your curriculum is already excellent, then you can always ask, how might you add challenge to knowledge building? How might you make it even better? There's always room for improvement. Thank you for listening, and I really hope that that has evoked some conversations, some discussions, some ideas, but most of all, some action in making the knowledge in your curriculum the best that it can possibly be. Thank you, and I will see you in the final video.